feel free to converse in Māori should you so wish during the meeting. Warm welcome to everyone who's here and members of the community, local boards, good to have you here. Now we've got apologies from Councillor Anai, Councillor Filipaina, Member Ngamane, Councillor Quack Stewart and Member Taipiri. Anyone else we've heard from? If not, I'm happy to move those. Is there a seconder? Councillor Penrose. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against, carried. And Councillor Penrose, just while we settle in, good work on the dog amnesty. I think, how many are you up to? You've been out this morning with our dog control. 1,228. That is extraordinary.
900 still unknown.
You're a hero. Thank you.
Get them.
All those people who can be saved now from menacing dogs, well done you.
That's the team.
What's
it's
that?
The management team.
Yeah.
Animal management team.
No, they're good. But good leadership. Declarations of interest? Nope, there are none. Confirmation of minutes. I'll move the 22nd of June.
Second.
With Councillor Darby, thank you. I'll put that. All those in favour, please say aye. Against, carried. No petitions, no public input. We've got our local board members who are warmly welcome. Extraordinary business, no, blah, blah. Nope. So I'll hand over to John in the first instance.
Great. So thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, councillors and local board members. So this is the last of our topic briefings before we receive the panel's recommendations on the 22nd of July. So that's under 3 weeks now. That was 3 weeks from last Friday. So we do have one more information briefing before the 22nd of July, and that will be on the process and some of the legal matters around receiving the panel's recommendations and the council's decision-making role. So, but this is the final topic session. So we have 3 topics in the report: transport, infrastructure, and natural hazards. So we're going to kick off with transport. I have Kevin Wong Toy here, who is our lead planner on transport, who was involved in the hearings before the panel and also mediation before the hearings took place. So as always, we're just going to start by a reference back to the regional policy statement. And Madam Chair, I'll probably just run through the whole presentation if that's okay and take questions at the end. It's fairly short. So in terms of the regional policy statement, there were four main themes in terms of transport. There they are on the screen. I won't read them out other than to just highlight integrating transport with land use is obviously a key part of the regional policy statement and the role that the unitary plan has to play in that regard. Movement of people, goods and services throughout Auckland and across to other regions, managing adverse effects and transport choice. So those are the main themes and they sort of flow right through into the rules of the unitary plan. Submitters' views in terms of the regional policy statement, obviously there was, as you'd expect, support for that integration of land use and transport. We don't want to be investing in transport where the land use isn't supporting it. We don't want to be allowing for certain types of land use and growth and so on without the transport being in place. So that came through as a strong theme. There were some submitters asking for greater recognition of different transport modes. So I guess that was some submitters feeling that the emphasis might have been on public transport rather than all modes of transport. So we heard that from some submitters. And other submitters wanting greater recognition of the adverse effects of transport, things like noise, air emissions and so on. So those were the key themes up at the regional policy statement. The approach that Council took into the hearing was really to retain the overall approach based on those 4 themes that I mentioned before. Some amendments to reinforce contribution transport makes to economic well-being came through, providing a bit more clarity on road-related noise mitigation if there are new roads going in place, particularly state highway extensions, major road widenings and so on. What should the approach be to mitigation? Should it be entirely on the landowners building in those areas in the future, or should also be some upfront mitigation when the roads are being built? References to port-related infrastructure. So we did have submissions from port company seeking that the transport section should mention the fact that the port is part of our overall transport system, and recognition of the hierarchy in the RMA of avoiding, remedying or mitigating adverse effects for high trip generating activities. So that's things like the supermarkets and so on. So there was greater recognition of not just avoiding adverse effects but also mitigation. So I suspect that one came from the retail sector. Moving on from the regional policy statement, one of the more innovative parts of the unitary plan has been, in my view, a shift away from always requiring a certain minimum number of car parks on site as part of a development. I think councils have heard for many years that some of those provisions are well out of date, and actually we're requiring far too many off-street car parks as part of a development. So with the unitary plan, there's a more balanced approach to requiring what we call minimums in some cases, but in other cases actually saying, well, there's a maximum number of car parks, because others sought that the minimum rates were reduced. So instead of having to provide, say, 10 car parks for development, 5 might be appropriate. In some cases, submitters were asking for those minimums to go back to the legacy district plan minimums, or even a higher rate, to ensure that there are no spillage of parking onto streets at all, that all parking must be self-contained off-site as part of the development. So that's those that we're asking for us to increase the minimum parking rules. Also, just that second bullet point from submitters, include minimum parking rules for the centres, town centres, and the terraced housing and apartment building zone. So this is where I think we were pretty bold and innovative, in that in town centres across Auckland under the unitary plan, by and large, there is no requirement to provide off-street parking.
That's correct.
Under the proposed unitary plan. And in the terraced house and apartment building zone, there is no requirement to provide off-street parking. You can provide it, but it's not required as a minimum. There are other zones where there is a minimum number of car parks required as part of the development. So we had submitters asking for minimums to be introduced into centres and the adjacent terrace and apartment building zone. We had submitters wanting to remove or amend maximum parking rates. So the maximums, that's the cap on the amount of parking you can provide within a development, generally apply in the city centre, as they have for many, many years here, and also in the metropolitan centres and some of the town centres. Town centres all had a maximum rate, so no minimums in those centres, but there was a cap on how much parking you provide. We did have submissions, particularly from the big retailers and some office developers, saying that those maximums should be removed, or they should be allowed to provide more parking and not be capped. And lastly, remove or amend the city centre fringe parking overlay. So this is the area around Freeman's Bay, Ponsonby, Newton, I think Parnell, where there's quite a unique parking situation, because you've got such significant employment in the CBD here that there are some quite unique parking issues in those areas. There's also the retail and entertainment, cafes, bars and restaurants in those areas, so there's quite a unique parking situation, and we had quite a customised approach to parking around the fringe of the city centre, worked through in quite a lot of detail before the plan was notified, and we had submitters asking for that to be removed or amended. And lastly, amend the city centre parking rules. So city centre has always had parking maximums, a cap on the amount of parking you can provide, and there were a small number of submitters asking for those maximums to be amended, typically increased. So that's parking, maximums and minimums. Where council landed at the hearings after mediation was essentially retaining the overall approach, applying maximum parking rules and no minimums in the larger centres and in the terraced housing and apartment building zone, and also in the mixed use zone. In terms of the residential zones, the parking rules that council proposed at the hearings are there. So in the single house zone, a minimum of 1 car park would be required for every dwelling. In the mixed housing suburban zone, again, a minimum of 1 car park per dwelling, no maximums in either of those zones. When we move into the more intensive mixed housing urban at 3 stories high, there was no minimum proposed or maximum for small studio 1-bedroom units, but a minimum of 1 car park for 2 or more bedrooms, which will bring it into line with single house and mixed housing suburban. And then in the THAB zone, recognising that this is a zone that's only applied around centres with good public transport. No minimum was proposed, so that's basically the status quo, and a maximum of 1 car park for studio 1-bedroom dwellings and a maximum of 2 spaces where there are 2 or more bedrooms. So introduction of a bit of a cap on the amount of parking you can provide as of right in the THAB zone. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these rules is there are provisions for applying for a resource consent to infringe these controls. I think it's restricted discretionary. So it's not a hard and fast non-complying, no flexibility at all, but it would put you in a resource consent process if you want to provide less car parks or more car parks than on the screen there in terms of residential. City centre fringe parking overlay was proposed to be removed and instead rely on the parking maximums, which are no minimums in the fringe office area. City centre parking rules essentially retained, and parking minimums proposed to be reduced in the historic character areas. So that 1 car park per dwelling in the single house zone is the one that we're referring to there. There is some flexibility proposed by council in historic character overlay areas to avoid forcing someone to provide off-street car parking that might compromise the character of a street of villas or bungalows, essentially. Moving on from, actually I'm just wondering, maybe it is worth taking some questions on parking, because this is quite a different topic.
Seen any hands go up? Councillor Cooper.
Thank you. I just wanted to, when we look at maximum parking, which I understand the concept, but we're having narrower roads in these areas and people will still have more than 1 car quite often, and I already get complaints of lots of people parking half on the footpath, half on the road, people can't get through, those sorts of things. So, and I know we can't put no parking signs everywhere. How is that, will there be rules about how we manage that kind of issue? Because at the moment we've got parking permits in some places, residential parking permits, because people who work don't want to pay for parking, so they'll park in St Mary's Bay or Ponsonby and walk down here, etc. That's my concern around this. We can have that, but will the rules define how we deal with that, or would it just be left open and then we'll just have lots of disputes?
I think when you
out in public.
Well, I think when you move towards a more compact city, if you look at cities overseas, it becomes less and less common that everyone has a car park or 2 car parks off street. So it's moving to a different approach where there is more reliance on how you manage your streets and how Auckland Transport manages parking on street. And so there's no doubt about it, as a city becomes more compact in certain parts, certain areas, you do need to be a lot more active in how you manage your streets and how you manage your parking on street. And that's just in line with other more compact, denser cities around the world in certain parts of Auckland. And we've already seen it happening. But yes, you can't, in the unitary plan, have specific requirements for the management of on-street parking, because that's Auckland Transport's role.
Thank you.
We can go back to this if something suddenly occurs to someone and you think, I wish I'd asked. We're fine to ask as we go on.
Okay. So, dedicated parking facilities is just, I guess, a little bit of jargon for car parking buildings or off-street parking lots that are dedicated just for parking. They're not tied in with a shopping centre or a residential development. They are standalone. It's your tournaments, your Wilson parking and Auckland Council parking typically. So in the notified plan, the rules distinguish between long-term and short-term parking, and they were customised to the different zones around Auckland. Long-term parking is where you can park there all day, so it's essentially commuters. Short-term parking is more your shoppers, people visiting a destination but not staying all day. So there was an easier path typically if it was for short stay, supporting retail and so on, but a more difficult path if it was for permanent long-term parking, because of some of the issues that arise with these types of parking facilities. So it was a discretionary activity for short term in the city centre, the fringe around the city centre here, metropolitan centres, town centres, local centres, and the mixed-use zone. It was fully discretionary for short term. Discretionary resource consent required for long term in metropolitan town and local centres in the mixed-use zone, but non-complying for long term parking in the city centre. Given the amount of existing long-term parking in the city centre and significant investment in public transport and the hub that the city centre is for public transport, and issues with congestion by allowing more and more all-day parking facilities in the city centre. Submitters' views were to make the status of long-term parking in the city centre and in the fringe area more permissive. So it's submitters there, and I assume that was Wilson and Tournament predominantly.
But some of the retailers as well, and some of the property interests within those centres. So they also felt that they should relax those particular rules around the non-accessory parking.
And council's position, a bit of a shift, restricted discretionary instead of full discretionary for long-term and also for short-term in the metropolitan town, local centres and the mixed-use zone, but holding the line with non-complying for new permanent long-term parking facilities in the city centre. We had significant involvement from Auckland Transport in developing these parking provisions or dedicated parking facilities.
That's correct. So Auckland Transport also have a separate strategy which provides guidance around how and when they provide different forms of parking, including dedicated or non-accessory parking. So they're also looking at, as part of that strategy, park and ride facilities. So they're one of the reasons for relaxing the activity status for non-accessory parking in those particular centre zones. It demonstrates a greater alignment between Auckland Transport's strategic direction in terms of the opportunities to provide for non-accessory or dedicated parking with their own strategy. Some of the benefits include consolidation and rationalisation of parking into one building, for instance, in a centre, or two buildings, which helps manage the number of access points which are required when you compare that situation to providing on-site parking for individual sites and the need to manage multiple access points in that particular scenario. So in short, there was greater alignment between the direction that we've taken in terms of the changes in Auckland Transport's kind of wider strategic outcomes that they're seeking in terms of parking.
I suppose you can't look at these issues in isolation. The work that Auckland Transport is doing is actually trying to look at a much more comprehensive way. I mean, we know that there are a lot of suburban streets nearby that are being used as park and rides, and there's a very large piece of work that's being developed in and around trying to complement what you've just explained.
Councillor Webster?
Well, it's probably along the same lines, and Councillor Fletcher may have answered it. I just want to be sure that park and rides are being treated differently to allow quicker and more easily built park and rides rather than having to go through too much bureaucratic nonsense when we need them quickly.
Yes, the plan does provide specifically for park and ride. It is a restricted discretionary activity, so there's quite a limited set of considerations around that.
And would that,
yeah.
Sorry, Madam Chair, can I explore that just a little bit further? Would that include temporary use of park and ride? I mean, I'll give you the example in Albany, where I think it's Wilson's or somebody, they've taken a bit of unused land. They've obviously tar sealed it or put gravel down. They're charging $1 for 12 hours, which is fantastic.
I think, councillor, we're probably
So it's probably
straying a
going
little
into
bit away
So
from...
I just wanted to know that whether in the unitary plan, I was using it as an example, there was going to be an ability for people to do temporary or whatever to answer a need.
To answer that question, park and ride has quite a specific definition in the unitary plan.
Okay.
So it's tied to the rapid and frequent transport network. So in some cases, that situation won't qualify.
Okay, thanks.
I guess the answer you're hoping, though, is it doesn't exclude that being
Yeah.
able to be done.
Yeah.
Councillor Penrose.
Yeah, and thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks, guys. This is, I think it's critical. I don't want to dive down into the detailed stuff, but it's critical for the fact being is that to AT, the PPP stuff is totally unknown to them. And I know that I've been talking with them some 7-8 weeks ago now, and they were totally oblivious to how it can actually gel, and some work going on there. But at the same token, we can't wait forever. We've got to get on and build it.
Okay. Councillor Lee?
Yes, I'm not sure we've got it right yet. This is a very, very complex matter, not just technical, also relates to human behaviour. I know Auckland Transport have been working on this for a number of years now, and they started off on the basis of a citywide approach, dealing with streets that were built before the motor car was actually invented, in the same way as streets that were built because the motor car was invented, and it proved to be quite problematic. Have we taken advice from overseas on this matter? Because members raised all the different complexities.
Yeah.
It is complex.
It is. Councillor, I'll get Mrs. Perrott to comment. Remember, this is just reminding us of the discussion and the background, so we can't deliberate or seek any further information at this stage, and we just need to be very cautious of that. So, okay. So I'm not too sure whether the question of did we seek information overseas is to be answered, John, but you might just like to make a comment.
I think, as we've always said, that this session is about telling you what was the council's position at the hearing. We do encourage you to go on to the Independent Hearings Panel website to see the evidence that the council did lodge, but also any other submitters' evidence lodged on the same topic. But I don't believe it's appropriate for us to start a conversation about the research
Listen, I just
or
asked
the
a question. Did
information.
we seek it, when we're talking about our evidence, did we have overseas advice as well or not? It's a simple question.
In terms of the evidence from council's point of view, there was quite an extensive survey of both operative district plans and some overseas examples in terms of how they had regulated around not only parking but other aspects of the transport rules as well. So there is a literature review, and it's quite comprehensive in the transport evidence.
All right.
Okay. Right, cycle parking. Now, some of the legacy district plans required off-street cycle parking, but it certainly wasn't common across the board. So with the unitary plan, we did propose minimum cycle parking and end-of-trip facilities, i.e. things like showers and lockers, for certain types of development. Larger office developments would have fallen into that category, and there was some guidance on the design and storage of cycles, bicycles. It was a restricted discretionary activity to infringe that and not provide any cycle parking at all, or any showers or lockers. So it didn't hit every development, but at a certain size of development, and certainly office would be a key one, there was a requirement. Submitters, they sought a range of changes from retaining the controls, amending them or deleting them, adding extra requirements in terms of what might be provided to encourage or facilitate or assist those who are commuting to work, not via private motor vehicle. Council's position at the hearing essentially was to retain the approach, just a slightly more graduated, refined set of rules, and a bit more clarity of exactly what the end-of-trip facilities might entail, but no major change there. Still a requirement for cycle parking with medium to large-scale developments.
Oh, Mark?
Madam Chair, my question's about on-street parking in residential suburbs, and I just, if you could just remind me what the implications were for the rules that we were talking about previously for on-street parking in residential.
So the unitary plan does not control on-street parking, it only controls off-street parking, and so the implications are that a move away from fairly high minimums towards lower minimums or no minimums in centres will mean Auckland Transport Council needs to be very active in managing the on-street parking, as Auckland Transport already is. But over time, you know, that's just a space that Auckland Transport needs to be working in.
And you're saying there are no unitary plan rules governing that?
On-street parking. So the unitary plan doesn't have P180 rules, it doesn't have resident-only parking rules.
No.
That all sits outside of the unitary plan.
Corridor width rules?
For new developments, for new subdivision, there are requirements for streets to be designed with on-street parking of certain widths and dimensions and so on for a new subdivision. Yeah.
Madam Chair, I don't know the specifics obviously, but obviously I'm just reflecting on Stonefields, and I suppose that the question would be the extent to which experiences we've had from Stonefields have fed into council's position.
So something like a Stonefields would go through a planning process and a plan change, and or a big complex subdivision where the street dimensions and the design of the streets would be looked at that stage in terms of parking. So, yeah.
And mindful,
that's the space the unitary plan works.
And mindful of the implications for what would be the new
development.
Yeah, on-street the new parking rules.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay.
Right. So apologies, a little bit more jargon here, but trip generation thresholds. So this is a way of the unitary plan ensuring that for developments, particularly things like a pack and save that are clearly going to generate a lot of traffic, your Mitre 10s, your pack and saves, large office developments, and so on. It's a way of being able to assess the traffic impacts of those developments, and the unitary plan takes an approach as notified of having a trigger or a threshold outside of the city centre, metropolitan town centres and the terraced apartment building zone where council can, along with AT, Auckland Transport and NZTA, assess the traffic impacts of those developments. But the key point there is that this trip generation threshold, vehicle trip generation threshold or trigger, did not apply in the city centre, metropolitan and town centres or the terraced apartment building zone. So it's essentially in the notified plan, it's a given that in those locations there will be developments that will generate significant volumes of traffic, and that's just simply anticipated, and there's a move away from having minimum requirements to hopefully encourage less on-street parking and in some cases, off-street parking, in some cases maximum parking rates. The submitters' view, some wanted to retain the rules, some wanted them deleted or exclude certain types of activities or uses, and some wanted certain activities or areas to be exempt completely from the rules. The council's approach was largely to retain the notified position, apart from just some refinement of the trigger or the threshold where a traffic assessment would be required, a catch-all for activities that weren't listed in a table that was in the notified plan, so that they would, at a certain trip level, have to come in for a traffic assessment, and there were some exclusions identified. But the overall approach of accepting that in the centres and the terraced apartment building zone, there wouldn't need to be a case-by-case assessment of whether there was too much traffic being generated or some traffic adverse effects, was retained as part of the council's position. It's mainly for out-of-centre large traffic generating developments.
Okay. Councillor Casey, question.
Oh, yeah, it's just that if we are informing the public about what's in the plan for them, are we going to demystify it a little bit by decoding it a little?
We can certainly do our best about that.
I think we need to.
Yeah, I guess the presumption is plans have plenty sort of language, but somewhere there needs to be something that actually explains what this does. Good call. Okay, right, next John.
Okay. Vehicle access restrictions. So there are some rules in the notified plan that restrict your access to a development site and put it through a resource consent assessment. So they, or they specify minimum widths of things like vehicle crossings. The vehicle access is not permitted, i.e. it's non-complying in the city centre zone on specified key retail frontages. So within the city centre here, there are streets that have been mapped where it's a non-complying activity to provide a vehicle crossing. Queen Street would be a classic example. So there are rules in the unitary plan that say if you're developing an office building or retail mixed use on Queen Street, then a vehicle crossing is a non-complying activity. Vehicle access requires restricted discretionary activity on specified motorway interchanges to avoid conflicts with motorway on and off ramps, and also level crossings and certain arterial roads. They're mapped in the notified plan, areas where if you want to have a vehicle crossing, you would need to obtain a resource consent. And there's a general rule there, the last bullet point, under the notified PORP, vehicle access requires restricted discretionary consent within 10 metres of intersections. Submitters' views, the use of vehicle crossings subject to these restrictions should be, or existing vehicle crossings should be permitted. So if someone already has a vehicle crossing, if they want to intensify the development on their site, we had submitters saying that that should be allowed. The crossing is already there, but in the notified plan, if you were intensifying a development, then you would you would trigger the need for resource consent. So submitters are asking for that to change. The rule about level crossings should be, a new rule should be introduced controlling new level crossings put in place by Kiwi Rail. And the state highway access rule should be deleted. So that was where the submitters were coming from in terms of restricting vehicle access to sites. Council's position at the hearing, again, was largely to retain the approach. There was an amendment proposed to recognise the use of existing crossings, which Kevin can speak to if you want more detail on that one. And the state highway-related vehicle crossing and access rule was proposed to be deleted. I might have to hand over to Kevin to explain those two as well.
Okay, in terms of the amendments to the vehicle access restrictions, as noted in the submitters' feedback, they were seeking that existing vehicle access points be recognised. So we did do that as part of the amendments through the hearings mediation process. So that's essentially recognising existing use rights, and then we developed a framework for assessing other situations where the applicant was not going to increase the number of vehicle crossings where these building frontage controls applied. So for instance, if a applicant was coming in and they already had 2 vehicle crossings in place, and if they wanted to either consolidate or relocate those 2 crossings, and they were undertaking a development as part of that vehicle relocation or consolidation, then that would trigger the need for a consent for council and Auckland Transport to assess the impacts of that particular reconfiguration of the vehicle access crossing. So I guess at the end of the day, it was a more refined approach to managing vehicle crossings rather than, I suppose it was more a blunt, black and white kind of rule which existed in the notified plan. So that's the essence of the change for the first bullet point. Second bullet point really represents NZTA recognising that the unitary plan had a bit of a process duplication, and to eliminate that duplication, it was a matter of deleting the requirements around vehicle access assessment by NZTA, because they already had a separate process under the Government Roading Powers Act to assess any new vehicle access or crossing which affected their network. So obviously if that's simplified and reduced the content in the plan, then we were happy to accept that, and they still had a mechanism to assess the impacts on their network.
All right, so The next topic relates back to the four themes that I discussed in the RPS, and this is the one around transport-related noise and managing the adverse effects of transport, and also managing the effects of development next to transport routes on the use of transport networks. So in the notified plan, there was an overlay called the High Land Transport Noise Overlay, and what it did was it required new activities or additions to existing activities, e.g. bedrooms or classrooms, sensitive to noise and located within the overlay, to be designed to comply with minimum specified internal noise levels. So essentially acoustic treatment of any new development in close proximity to high transport routes. And the trigger for that was the next bullet point. It's, if you were, within 40 metres of either side of roads carrying over 20,000 vehicles per day, existing or predicted future volumes, and rail corridors with more than 12 nighttime and 6 daytime train movements. So if you're in that sort of corridor, then in order to avoid getting a resource consent, you would have to have an acoustic treatment to get a certain internal noise level for habitable rooms. Submitters' views: retain, remove, reduce or increase extent of the overlay, provide compensation for people in this overlay if they're having to do noise mitigation as part of a new development, and amendments proposed to the wording of the objectives and policies and rules. Council's position was to retain the overlay, not to delete it, and the refinements were to increase the maximum internal noise level for bedrooms and sleeping areas during the daytime. So there's a technical change there to just allow for a higher level of internal noise at daytime, and extend the overlay to 80 metres where it was adjacent to the state highway or motorway network where there are more than 70,000 vehicles per day. So based on some acoustic modelling, noise modelling, the 40 metres was, I guess, demonstrated to be insufficient where you're getting up to volumes of 70,000 vehicles per day, and next to the rail corridors as well. And increase of the application of the rule to include things like care centres, childcare centres, for example. Questions on the overlay?
Okay, Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, John, does that include extensive renovations, or someone going from a single house putting in a terraced house sort of position? Does new cover that definition?
That's my understanding it would.
Yeah. Thanks.
So it's not forcing anyone to do any acoustic treatment of their existing house, but once you're starting to add bedrooms or redevelop, then you would. Okay. Right, moving on to the strategic transport corridor zone. So roads in the unitary plan are generally just shown as a road. They're not zoned business, residential, transport road. They have their own specific set of rules in the unitary plan, but for the strategic transport corridor zone we do have a zone, and that covers the state highway network and the rail network. It provides for a wide range of transport activities, as cycleways, park and ride and so on. It provides for an integrated transport system and interim or short-term non-transport activities, which is the key point. The zone allows for more than the designations that apply on the motorway network and the rail network would typically allow for, and that's just to provide for some interim use of bits of land that are not currently being used as road that may be used in the future, but there's still some uncertainty around that. So the designation will remain the main primary means of managing, operating the rail network and the state highway network. So they've got the benefit of a designation, which essentially overrides the unitary plan, but this strategic transport corridor zone was developed to just allow a little bit more flexibility for bits and pieces of land here and there within the designation that might not be critical to transport at this point in time. Submitters' views provide for bus stops in the strategic transport corridor zone, so that was, bus depots, and provide for interim non-transport activities. They should have the same activity status as the zone adjoining them. So if residential is permitted next to the rail corridor, then if there's some land surplus to requirements for now within the rail corridor, then residential should have the same activity status Obviously, there's the noise issues to deal with, but probably not the best activity to pick, but that's an example of what the submitters were asking for there. The council's position was to retain the notified approach, but amendments to provide for bus depots in the strategic transport corridor zone, and amendments to provide for interim non-transport activities on the same basis as adjoining zones. So in the notified plan, there were certain non-transport activities that had a specific status in the zone, and council moved towards accepting that that status should be aligned to the residential, business or rural zone that happens to be right next to the zone, the transport corridor zone. Questions on? Okay, and last but not least, the rail corridor safety. So in the notified plan, there were no rules dealing with rail corridor safety. Submitters, so this was Kiwi Rail essentially, predominantly, were asking for a safe clearance between activities on land adjacent to the rail network and the introduction of a 4-metre yard setback in all zones to provide for electrical safety. So the concern there is with the electrification of the rail network, situations where you might have an apartment building with balconies right hard up against the rail corridor. That was seen as a big concern for Kiwi Rail. So council's position at the hearing was a rule that applies across the whole of Auckland, so it's not customised to any zone, and that required any buildings or structures within 2.5 metres of the rail corridor to be set back 2.5 metres. So a bit of a compromise there, and I think Kiwi Rail were comfortable in the end with 2.5.
They were comfortable with that, yeah, and it just basically provides council with an opportunity to make that assessment should there be a building within that particular buffer from the rail corridor.
And those apartments at Onehunga, they must be the closest.
That's one example that was highlighted.
Okay, and that's it for transport, with the reference to where the council's evidence and the evidence of submitters is on the panel website, topics 43 and 44.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, just welcome Suki Singh, who's our one of our leads on infrastructure, and we'll start again with the regional policy statement, approach to infrastructure and energy, and we'll also touch on airports as well. So in the notified plan, there was a real focus on what we called significant infrastructure at the regional policy statement level, and that included the transport, electricity, water, wastewater, telecoms and ports and the airports. A lot of reference to protecting significant infrastructure from reverse sensitivity, so more sensitive activities next to infrastructure causing problems for the operation of the infrastructure itself. The RPS recognised the locational function-based requirements of significant infrastructure and its need to be located in certain places, so some recognition that significant infrastructure cannot always avoid being in the coastal management area and the coastal marine area, cannot always avoid being in some of the overlay areas such as significant ecological overlays. Things like water reservoirs and transmission lines often cross or are located within some of the unitary plan overlays. And there was guidance in the RPS on managing the effects of new or major upgrades on things like significant ecological areas or outstanding natural landscapes. Council's position at the hearings was to support the overall approach in the notified plan. The definition of significant infrastructure was proposed to be extended to include all of the network or parts of the network, not just the core elements, and amendments to the policy framework for reverse sensitivity effects on infrastructure, requiring new sensitive activities to avoid in the first instance and in the second instance remedy or mitigate if that's not practicable. So that was the regional policy statement. We had some interim guidance from the panel on infrastructure, and the panel felt, so this was February last year, having heard submissions on the regional policy statement, that there should be a standalone section for infrastructure. So infrastructure issues were incorporated in, I think, the economic wellbeing section of the regional policy statement. So they felt, having listened to submitters such as the Auckland Utility Operators Group, that infrastructure should have a standalone chapter in the RPS. So it probably wouldn't be too surprising if the recommendations that come in July 22nd have got a standalone RPS chapter on infrastructure. They felt that the definition in the RMA was sufficient and that the unitary plan really didn't need its own definition other than to add some related facilities. They didn't support the focus on significant infrastructure in the RPS. They felt that the term infrastructure should be used, that the council should drop the term significant, and all parts of infrastructure are part of an interconnected network. They felt that social facilities were not, or shouldn't be treated the same as other forms of infrastructure. So a council's definition of significant infrastructure included things like schools and hospitals, and the panel was saying in its interim guidance they felt that they should be treated differently to other forms of infrastructure, and that the PORP should recognise that infrastructure may be located in sensitive areas where there's a functional need, and I guess that's consistent with Council's approach, that where there's no practical alternative subject to assessment of adverse effects, it should be recognised that infrastructure sometimes simply cannot avoid being in those sensitive areas like significant ecological areas and landscapes. Moving into the district plan and regional plan rules, so moving out of the RPS interim guidance. So in the notified plan, for infrastructure and network utilities, the plan recognised that infrastructure is critical for the functioning of Auckland, rules to enable operation, maintenance, minor upgrading, rules to protect infrastructure, or policy framework to protect infrastructure from reverse sensitivity effects, and some guidance on managing the effects of new or major upgrades on high environmental value areas of high environmental value, So we had Auckland Utility Operators Group, so there was significant meetings and mediation with AUG and others prior to the hearing. They supported the policy framework in principle, but they wanted more permissive controls for operation, maintenance and minor upgrading in particular. Generally sought a more restrictive policy framework to manage reverse sensitivity impacts on infrastructure, and they wanted a standalone chapter in the unitary plan, not just at the regional policy statement. Down in the rules, they wanted a standalone one-stop shop where you go and find out everything about what consents you required or didn't require for infrastructure. So rather than having to look at the landscape chapter of the unitary plan or the ecological area chapter and the heritage chapter, they wanted that all in a one-stop shop for infrastructure. Council's position at the hearings, again, support the overall approach. Substantial agreement reached with AUG regarding amendments, mainly clarifying wording. Quite a detailed issue here. Council didn't support amateur radio as a permitted activity in residential zones. Strictly discretionary.
Is that a new provision?
I think that the legacy district plans had various ways of dealing with amateur radio. Some would have put them through a resource consent, some would have permitted them. So after discussions with the amateur radio operators, we reached an approach of restricted discretionary status. So we had a mixed approach before. Council didn't support overhead electricity lines being permitted in rural and coastal areas, rural and coastal towns and serviced and unserviced villages, supported discretionary status, and didn't support activity status for electrical vehicle charging stations and roads being permitted. Auckland Transport's preference was for those charging stations to be restricted discretionary, so they've got good control over where they're located. So, Madam Chair, shall we take questions on the way through? This one is shorter than the last one.
Thanks, John. This might sound stupid, but presumably this includes water care and Auckland Transport. Are they part of the...
They're part of infrastructure, and yeah, there are rules in the unitary plan that control the activities of water care and Auckland Transport. So it applies to them as well as others.
Questions? Councillor Casey?
Hospitals, significant infrastructure. What about storage facilities? I was thinking about the diesel storage in Lake Pupuki.
Wherry Oil Terminal, for example, is identified as significant infrastructure, so there is a minimum amount of fuel storage facility. So petrol stations, for example, won't be classified as a significant infrastructure, but those bulk storage facilities would be.
So how do you know if it is or isn't?
The definition, I believe, includes a minimum of 50,000 litres or something. I haven't got
50,000 litres?
something like that. I'll look it up for you in a second.
I guess
It's
one would
unlikely to apply to hospitals,
No.
from memory. No,
Not big enough.
it was set at a
Very
volume
high
of diesel that's well above what a hospital would normally store. But there are other rules in the unitary plan that control the storage of hazardous chemicals.
Less than 50,000.
Yeah.
Councillor Lee?
The ATAP process, while it's stopped short, somewhat elusive about identifying transport modes, probably for obvious reasons, it does emphasise quite a lot route protection, transport route protection. Is there anything in the unitary plan to give route protection, transport route protection, pause?
There is for major projects that have gone through a notice of requirement to designate the land. So designations for various major transport projects are already in the unitary plan. But for new emerging projects coming out of things like ATAP and Transport for Future Urban Growth, they would typically, depending on the scale of them,
Or the Auckland plan?
Yep, would go through a notice of requirement to designate the land to protect that route. So NZTA, for example, are already looking at, and Auckland Transport, new designations for new routes coming out of things like ATAP. But, yeah.
Happy with that answer, councillor? Right, next.
Okay. Electricity transmission corridor. So this is for the high voltage lines across Auckland, managing subdivision and development in proximity to the lines. The notified plan has a 12-metre either side of the centre line of the transmission lines, a corridor mapped in the unitary plan, and it also has, it's 12 metres from the edge of the support structures as well, so it goes out from the support structures to manage development under the lines. It restricts activities sensitive to transmission lines, for example, dwellings, care centres, hospitals. Within the corridor, it's a non-complying activity in the notified plan. Submitters, well, Transpower was the key submitter. They sought 3 different corridors. The National Grid Yard, that's a 12-metre one, but they were also seeking a 32 or a 37-metre control, and National Grid substation corridor extending up to 150 metres from substations and 500 metres, 500 metres of substations. Council's position at the hearings was to rename the overlay, the National Grid Corridor Overlay, instead of the ETC, and supported the overall approach. So not much change there, really. We stuck with the 12-metre either side of the centre line. I think Transpower was sort of coming around to accepting that approach. Can you recall?
No, there was quite
Still
a
opposed?
Transpower was still opposed to that, so we agreed to disagree on that point, really.
Does this apply to pylons or just towers and poles?
Pylons, towers, poles. Yep, pylons as well.
What about pylons that are already right plonk in the middle of residential areas?
Then anyone intensifying the development under them would have to go through a resource consent. It wouldn't be permitted as of right. That's the purpose of it, yeah. So it's not just in rural areas, it's in existing urban areas that has the biggest impact.
Simon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. John, just interested in terms of this gives effect to MPSET, the National Policy Statement on Electricity Transmission.
Yep.
obviously that envisaged the I think they, at one point they were calling it red, orange and green system, but basically that step down process. Does this meet our obligations under that national policy statement?
We believe that it does, and that's the evidence and legal submissions that we presented to the panel, that we are complying with what the council is required to comply with in terms of the district plan provisions. So.
And obviously this is a key issue for our area, and we had a number of submitters on the public side, but also from businesses and things. In terms of how that discussion went, obviously you've relayed where things got to with Transpower, but the other submitters, are you able to kind of colour the view of where other submitters were sitting in terms of what was worked out?
We had another expert working on this. From what I understand, Housing New Zealand had a slightly different view on that in terms of intensifying some of their properties, but council has retained its notified position in terms of what is in the plan.
And in terms of, our board worked quite strongly on this with the team, and really do appreciate the work. In terms of the other policy statements that sit alongside the plan, which talk about any new lines or any significant upgrades, the preference being that they be undergrounded. Obviously that's not a legal requirement, but a strong moral one at least. Has that been retained in submissions, or was that challenged as well?
We think that we retained that because there was a policy statement in the initial plan as notified, stating a strong preference for undergrounding, so we'll probably have to just double check that and get back to you on whether
I
that's
certainly know it was in
retained.
the draft because I drafted it and said let's do this, but it would be good if it's retained. But there was no real challenging in terms of submitters on that.
Again, we don't have our expert who was in the hearing on this, so we probably have to just come back to you with some information about where the submitters were coming from on this issue, and also the undergrounding issue.
Great. Yep. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Right. Oops. And that's the end of the show. We just lost it up on that screen there.
It's lost at airports.
Airports.
No.
I think we've all got the hard copy, so is it okay if I just crack on? Okay, so airports. The notified plan incorporated a number of airport-related provisions. There was an aircraft noise overlay, and the purpose of that was to manage subdivision of land and development of land in areas subject to aircraft noise. There was an airport approach path overlay, and that was to manage obstacles in the flight paths of the airports. There was an airport zone, which provided for the operation of small airports and airfields, and precincts applying to Auckland Airport and Ardmore to recognise the operation of Ardmore and Auckland Airport. And in addition to that, airports, some of them are designated in the unitary plan: Auckland Airport, Ardmore Airport and Whenuapai Air Base. So there's sort of a multi-layered approach to airports. Just skip ahead. Submitters' views. So Auckland airports and other airport operators generally supported, asking for more permissive controls and more restrictive controls to manage activities next to airports. The general public sought changes to the noise controls, to control noise and address amenity effects related to aircraft flight paths and approach paths. So general public were seeking to, constrain some of the activities of airports in terms of flight paths and noise generation. Auckland Airport sought the extension of the aircraft noise overlay to provide for an extension of the second runway, but that extension has not yet been formally applied for by way of a new designation, but they were still seeking extra noise controls on development within the flight paths to an extended new runway. And Housing New Zealand wanted a relaxation of the noise rules under the aircraft noise overlay. Council's position, really not any major changes. Supported the mapping or the spatial extent of the aircraft noise overlay for Auckland Airport until such time as they lodged that notice of requirement to extend the second runway. So Auckland Airport has a designation for the second runway, but Auckland Airport is looking to designate an extended runway until such time as that designation is progressed. Council's view was that it was premature to start restricting development in flight paths to an extended second runway. We opposed the relaxation of the rules for ASAN, which is activity sensitive to aircraft noise, so residential development, care centres within the aircraft noise overlay. And Council opposed changes to the flight control paths. So we did have quite a large number of submitters from Mount Albert, those sorts of areas where the airport had been trialling new flight paths, and so that, I guess, triggered a number of submitters to say that the unitary plan should be doing something about these flight paths, but legally the RMA does not allow council control or take into account noise effects from aircraft once they are lawfully airborne. So it's not something the unitary plan could deal with, and it was something that the panel had to advise submitters that they did not have the jurisdiction to control aircraft noise once they're above a certain height. So it has to be dealt with through a separate process. Okay, so that's airports.
Questions, Councillor Lee?
In terms of airports and I guess ports, it's almost the assumption is that the transport effects end at the tarmac, and yet if 17 million people go through the airport, a large proportion of they generate numerous transport effects, probably greater than 17 million. Is that kind of recognised at all, or does the airport stop on the tarmac?
No, I think the airport. Well, the airport is subject to all of the other rules in the unitary plan dealing with things like discharging into coastal marine areas and things like that. In terms of development that might generate traffic effects, there's
Traffic effects, yeah.
I don't know if there's specific traffic effects for the airports.
I believe that the airport, Auckland Airport Precinct, as part of their development, they have to provide reports in terms of what some of the traffic impacts of the activities will be.
So
I think we're looking at that in a completely, in a complete way in terms of effects, especially in transport. I'm coming back to route protection, of course, and the need that when you get 17 million trips, it doesn't stop, people don't stop at the tarmac. They theoretically could go 360 degrees, but they don't. They go down one or two corridors, essentially.
Okay. Councillor Watson?
Yeah, thank you. Just one question in relation to the aircraft noise overlay. One of the issues that's come up with is in respect of whanuapai, which is quite a different kettle of fish than Mangere. It's a different type of aircraft noise. So does the unitary plan draw a distinction between just straightforward landings and takeoffs, and for instance helicopters doing circuits for 4 hours of the day, or a plane's engine being tested for 3 or 4 hours? Does it get down to that level of distinction, or is it just more landing and taking off?
When an airport such as Whenuapai puts forward its notice of requirements in terms of their operations, that determines the scope of their noise effects. So as part of their designation, they would have had to say how many helicopter flights pass and all of those detailed noise effects as part of that, and that's what is then mapped in the unitary plan. I don't know the exact details of that, but certainly that forms the umbrella of the noise overlay that is contained in the port.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the last topic under transport and infrastructure and energy is hazardous facilities. So in the notified plan, the regional policy statement referred to managing location of sensitive activities to address risk to human health. For example, risk of emergency events like explosions and so on. District plan provisions in the unitary plan provided for the management of hazardous substances but they did not manage incompatible uses in close proximity to hazardous facilities. So we're talking things like the Wirri oil terminal, other hazardous facilities, the gas line, and so on, that runs across Auckland. So submitters wanted regionally and nationally important hazardous facility operators, not all submitters, they wanted buffers to protect sensitive land uses from risks of hazardous facilities, so that hazardous facilities were not compromised by conflicting land uses. Council's position at the hearing. So there was an acknowledgement of Council that it's not possible for these hazardous facilities to ensure absolutely 100% that in an unforeseen event there isn't some hazard beyond the boundary of the site. And I guess that's what the whole issue comes down to. Should these hazardous facilities be able to manage 100% with all safety precautions in place, all risk, or should there be some recognition in the entry plan that they can't do that? So Council did recognise that it's not possible to internalise emergency events completely within a facility. There are some unforeseen things that can happen even with the best safety procedures in place. So off the back of that, there was a proposal to introduce new provisions to set a framework for what are called emergency management areas for hazardous facilities. Those areas were mapped based on a risk assessment that was undertaken by the Council's expert. And this emergency management area was applied to, but that's not the entire pipeline, when sensitive activities, i.e. residential or childcare centres, are proposed in that 40-metre buffer area, then notification could be given to Refining New Zealand, and Refining New Zealand would then assess and put forward mitigation proposals for the Council to consider as part of that resource consent process. For example, using concrete slabs over the affected part of the pipeline. And that's it on hazardous facilities, and that's the end of the presentation on infrastructure and energy.
Councillor Webster and Councillor Casey.
Yes, just on that last point, refining for the pipeline, how are you going to get over that in rural areas where somebody might put a concrete race or bridge across the top without realising it, because they don't have to go for resource consent?
Everyone knows where the
I think the preference is for concrete slabs to be used rather than avoided. So that last point is that if you're looking at doing an apartment, a residential building, then you would have to have a...
Sorry, John, I read it wrong. Okay, thanks.
Just ask if we had anything defined as a hazardous facility. Does Council have anything defined as a hazardous facility?
any of Council's facilities?
Chamber.
What?
Chamber.
Chamber.
Council chambers,
Very explosive.
So we'll have to get back to you on that.
So,
Mr.
you know,
Casey.
our Hasmobile, is that ours?
Yeah.
Yep.
It's gone.
Anymore, unfortunately.
Oh,
That would have been a long time ago.
Sold it,
Sadly.
very sadly.
It went when we amalgamated
so where does a hazardous go?
Actually,
landfills.
we do. The tank farms down at
Transfer
Wynyard
station.
Quarter
Yeah.
are on Council land,
Space there, a transfer station.
Yeah.
but
No.
not operated or managed by Council.
Yeah.
So
But, you know, if you think of water care, places like that, I mean, we would have,
Yeah.
you know, areas for methane processing. We'd have, you know, on our landfill sites and things like that, we'd have quite a lot of hazardous storage. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Also
Water
in places like our city parks, depots, where they would be storing certain chemicals, etc. That would be considered a hazardous facility as well.
Madam Chair, would the port be considered in the same? I mean, there's all sorts of stuff coming in and out.
I think we just need to be,
We own the port.
we've got hazardous facilities, but then you have hazardous waste that, or, you know, you have hazardous materials that are stored on facilities that are not classified as hazardous facilities, and I think we're crossing over the two. Like Auckland, North Shore Hospital's not a hazardous facility, but it has
Hazardous
hazardous
substances.
substances stored on the footprint of that land, and I think it's we've got separate but related issues to deal with it.
Okay.
Okay, councillor Cashmore.
John, as far as the gas pipeline from the south and the oil pipeline from the north, is the unitary plan future-proofing those for protection as well? For, increasing the size capacity thereof?
Those, the pipeline's already designated, and I understand there is some capacity in that pipeline at the moment.
That's the oil and the gas?
That's the gas pipeline.
Yes.
I'm not sure about the oil one, to be honest. I know the gas pipeline does have capacity.
So you,
I was talking about protecting it for future, Madam Chair, so if there's a designation of a corridor that it travels through, that it's enough to
so
protect.
that,
It
that's,
is designated.
They're both designated, yeah.
yep, no, I'm well acquainted with that, because it went through our neighbour's property in Swanson, so, and that's very clearly designated. Everyone knows where the pipeline goes, and I would imagine if it needed to be trebled or quadrupled, that corridor would accommodate that. Any other questions? Nope.
Okay.
Natural hazards.
All right, just welcome Lara Clark, who's one of our lead planner on natural hazards and flooding. All right, so this is a fairly lengthy and technical PowerPoint that we've handed out. So what I propose to do is really just go through the front third of it and see how we go. If there's an appetite for going into a lot more technical detail on specific natural hazards, we can keep on going, or we can leave you with the presentation and you can come back to us if you have any specific questions after getting through the first part. So just some background. The RMA requires councils to manage risks from natural hazards in things like the unitary plan. There are two main categories of natural hazards. There's the more frequently occurring hazards such as flooding, coastal erosion and land instability, and then there are the other hazards that are less frequent but they typically much higher magnitude, for example volcanic eruptions, tsunami and earthquakes. The objectives and policies in the proposed unitary plan talk about both types of hazards, but the rules in the unitary plan don't deal with volcanoes or tsunami or earthquakes. They really deal with the more frequently occurring things like flooding and coastal erosion, land instability. So in the regional policy statement, there's an approach of not increasing risks to people and property and infrastructure, and that those risks should be reduced wherever possible, and minimising any adverse effects on the environment. There's also reference in the regional policy statement to what's called the natural conveyance function of floodplains and overland flow paths, that they have a very important natural function and that they should be protected from adverse effects of development and infrastructure. That the effects of climate change should be taken into account. They should be considered, looking longer term in terms of hazards. That natural defence systems, natural defences and systems should be maintained and where practical enhanced, rather than using hard concrete and steel engineering for things like flooding and coastal erosion, inundation. Requires the scale of and location of activities that are vulnerable to hazards to be managed, and gives effect to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement in terms of coastal hazards. And the RPS also provides for infrastructure that's functionally and operationally required to be in these hazard areas. It does recognise that infrastructure sometimes is in hazardous areas because there's no other practical option. Also in the notified plan, there was an approach of managing risks from hazards and avoiding creating new risks, and appropriately managing existing risks. That hazards should not be exacerbated through the subdivision or development of land. Identification of hazards and consideration of the 1% AEP event, which is colloquially referred to as the 100-year event. And that was for coastal erosion and flood hazards. Applies a risk-based approach to decision-making, and when we say risk-based approach for hazards, we're talking about what's the type of hazard, what's the probability of it happening, and what's the vulnerability of the activity? Obviously, things like industrial activities are less vulnerable to hazards than residential, possibly. It depends on the specifics. So, requirement for resource consent when subdividing or developing land within hazard areas. Where the submitters were coming from, some were seeking to change the policy approach to provide for more permissive, simplified hazard provisions. Some sought to retain or strengthen the approach to recognise hazards in Auckland, such as flooding and coastal erosion. There was some clarification sought around the types of natural hazards that need to be considered, the spatial areas where the rules apply, and the specific types of resource consent that would apply in the, and also the annual event probability factor, whether it should be 1 in 100 years or 1 in 50 or 1 in 200, and request that natural hazard provisions facilitate provision, maintenance and operation of infrastructure in these hazard areas. So that was coming from the infrastructure providers. Guidance from the hearings panel on hazards. The panel indicated that they agreed that the unitary plan should seek to not increase risks in areas of existing activities and avoid the creation of new risks where there's new development happening. So that was consistent with the council's approach, not increasing where there's existing development, and if there's new development happening, there should be avoidance of creating new risks. Although, however, the panel felt that some of the rules in the unitary plan were starting to double up on the Building Act, particularly in terms of things like flooding controls and floor levels. The panel considered that there were other methods outside of the unitary plan to address natural hazards, for example, the Building Act. The panel confirmed, however, that the unitary plan provisions should acknowledge the functional needs of particular types of infrastructure to be located in hazard areas. And lastly, the panel expressed some concern in relation to how the natural hazards are considered in the subdivision provisions of the unitary plan. So in picking up on the panel's guidance and reviewing the submissions, the council's position was to put forward some amendments to more explicitly state that the risks of adverse effects from natural hazards in urban areas should not increase, and that in new areas should be avoided altogether. So that's consistent with the panel's approach, and just really tightening up some of the wording there. Council put forward amendments to specifically provide for rural activities within natural hazard areas where the risks can be managed. Council put forward an approach of natural hazard rules focused on flood hazards, coastal inundation, erosion and land instability. So that was submitted saying, clarify exactly what natural hazards the unitary plan is controlling. So the council did clarify that those were the specific hazards that the unitary plan was seeking to control through rules. And there were some specific design requirements for buildings within the hazard areas. In the notified plan, the council proposed that they should be deleted. Sorry, I've just skipped ahead there. Rural activities, okay, sorry, skipped ahead. So the last bullet point, that the likely effects of climate change need to be considered in relation to all hazards. So the council continued to adopt that approach. Amendments proposed to more properly provide for infrastructure in hazard areas where it's functionally required to be there. Amendments proposed the subdivision provisions to align them with the natural hazard provisions, strengthening assessment where required when subdividing in natural hazard areas, and this is the one I skipped to, specific design requirements for buildings within flood hazard areas were proposed to be deleted, thereby removing the potential for direct conflict with the Building Act. The next series of slides really just go into a bit more detail around specific hazards, and they are quite detailed and fairly technical in nature, so it's really just the question as to whether you'd like us to carry on, or we can respond to any questions that you might have after reading the presentation in your own time.
John, could you just speak some more about the interim guidance regarding the panel's concern in relation to how natural hazards are considered in the subdivision provisions? I know you picked that up. terms of council's response, but what was their concern in a bit more detail, and what changes did we make in response to that?
It's probably one for Lara.
So the subdivision topic followed the natural hazards topic in the hearing schedule. The way in the notified plan that it was represented, there was more specific reference to flood hazards than there were to the full suite of hazards which are controlled through the rules. So what we really did there was look at the subdivision provisions and tie them a bit more strongly to the policies and the policy direction around the coastal hazards and around the land stability hazards, so that those areas were more clearly identified. So when you're looking to subdivide, you'd not only be considering flood hazard areas, but you'd also be considering some of those other hazard areas more specifically.
So the panel's concern was more about connecting the dots, as it were, between the policies and the rules?
That's the way that we interpreted that concern, yes.
Right, thanks.
Any other questions on it? Councillor Cashmore.
Just the sea rise 2 metre deal, just a bit more information about that. Is that going to be for, again, is it going to be covering alterations or just new or additions or etc.?
Okay, so the way that the sea level rise component was incorporated in the notified plan, we had it as a policy consideration, and it was to be considered for new development or greenfield development, and for that significant infrastructure, which my colleagues have talked about earlier today. There weren't any particular rules associated with that 2 metre sea level rise inclusion. Through the hearings process and after receiving the panel's guidance, we looked again at the inclusion of that 2 metre figure, and in council's closing position we've taken out that reference to the 2 metre specifically and replaced it with a consideration of a longer term sea level rise, which enables the most recent guidance, the most recent IPCC or Ministry for the Environment projections to be considered, but there aren't any specific rules associated with that area. It's more of a structure planning and a major infrastructure consideration.
Lose a degree of certainty, Madam Chair, potentially?
I guess we might have to see what comes back
Through on that, yeah.
to us. Yeah. Councillor Webster.
Sorry, John, maybe you could talk to me about this later. I mean, obviously the coastal hazards one is going to be quite important in parts of the north of here. Can you just talk to me about where we got to with hard versus natural protections?
Yep. To that.
Do we want to do
Yeah.
that when we get to that bit, John? We could maybe.
Well,
I just thought he was going to just be.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm
okay.
suggesting there
I
are
just
there are
wondered if we
16
wanted to
slides, and
just-
some of them do get very
Okay.
detailed and technical. So
Sorry, I just.
No, that's good.
I
All I was
just-
going to do was just kind of go, you know, wildfire.
We don't need that.
Wildfire, instability, liquefaction.
Liquefaction.
What worries you? Pick your worry.
Well,
Right,
my worry is
coastal
coastal.
erosion.
But I mean, I don't want to hold up the
No,
meeting.
it's good. That's what this is for.
So I've just skipped forward to the council's position on coastal hazards. So apologies. The question again was, Councillor Webster, just coastal defences. Okay. Someone there? No.
It was more you said something about
Here we go.
hard
So
versus
council's
soft.
position on coastal defences on the screen there. Really enhancement and maintaining existing natural defences should be provided for. So make that a permitted activity if you're essentially stabilising an existing sand dune, for example, with planting. That shouldn't have to go through a resource consent. Yeah, so that was the first point, but still maintaining that approach of a preference for soft engineering rather than hard engineering solutions.
I think just building on what John said there, that's one of the key links, I guess, back to the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement. That national policy direction does direct the resource management plans to prefer natural defences where you can and to avoid hard engineering where you can. Obviously, it recognises in certain circumstances hard engineering might be needed, and that's where the last bullet point there around the assessment really reflects looking at what the activity is that is being protected, and how those defences are designed to make sure that they are really addressing as many of the potential adverse effects as possible. The other issue with the use of hard defences is the effects on the neighbouring properties or the rest of the coastal area, and so it's trying to ensure that there's a really good consideration of all of those potential effects, alongside the need for the defence and the activity that it protects.
I suppose we can't, I mean, we won't know until we get some examples, but you know, I think this is going to be a big issue in some areas, how quickly we are able to, and that will depend on whether it's discretionary or restricted discretionary. Yep, thank you.
Other hazardous issues? Anything else you want to add?
No, that's it really.
Okay.
So that's the last of the topics.
Well, on the 22nd.
Crikey. So just as was explained, this is, hopefully we've had a chance to go through, understand what all the topics, how we got to where we got to with all the topics, so that when it all comes back to us, we can go back to the excellent presentations that we've had and remind ourselves of what we said. And the last workshop will be reminding us of the process to go through from here. So any other questions?
Can I just remind you, we've also sent out a form for you to work with your support staff to come back to us if there are specific topics, and I know a number of councillors have already come back to us with some specific topics or questions that you might want to ask between now and the 22nd of July. So,
And just also for the local boards, working on the process by which the local boards are given all of the information that they may need through this process. Councillor Casey.
Oh, it was just to ask formally about the public awareness campaign. I missed the email from Carol Ferguson, and I guess a couple of my colleagues might have too. So could you maybe explain the relevance of for example, the infomercial in this morning's Herald?
So as Councillor Casey has indicated, you should have all received an email from Carl Ferguson, who's the Director of Communications, last week, talking about a public awareness campaign. This is really building on the interest that has been expressed in a number of different media about the wider housing issue affecting Auckland, and really, if you think of the Auckland conversation a couple of weeks ago, there was quite a lot of energy around what is happening around housing. And so what the memo sets out is that we've put in place a relationship with the New Zealand Herald, where they are going to give us a platform of being able to speak about all the work that the council is doing in the housing space. The first one was the interview with Dean Kimpton, where he talked about the survey about housing awareness, the housing challenge, which was a survey of a number of different people in the community and the challenges they faced in actually acquiring or getting the housing that they need for their particular purposes. And he also touched on the fact that housing choice was something that was important from the Auckland plan and what we've tried to incorporate into the unitary plan. But then the rest of the interview goes on to really just reminding people about all the things that are happening in the housing space in terms of the special housing areas, the consents that we're receiving to build new houses and subdivision. So it is It is an awareness campaign. It is about making sure that everybody is aware of what the council is doing in that housing space. It is also will be reminding people of the process that the unitary plan is following, both up to the decisions, but also once the decision has been made by this council, we'll be informing the community about that.
All right. Thank you all for your attendance today. It is appreciated to our staff, and to our members of, our loyal members of the public, and our local boards. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Kia ora.